Welcome, everyone, to the Jesus Culture Podcast, episode 53, but video episode number 2.
Episode 53, video episode number 2, and then there was a big gap.
A huge gap.
We're kind of like those parents that have like 3 kids in a row.
Yep.
You know, all like a year apart, and then they wait 10 years to have their 4th kid. That's what we've been doing during COVID.
Oh.
We had a big gap.
We've had a big gap in
But we
in
have
podcasts.
more children.
Yes.
And we don't love our children
They're
any less.
just as important.
They're just as important.
Absolutely.
In fact, they're better because they're on video now.
But during that gap, we have been hard at work setting up everything that you're seeing here. And we're really excited to be bringing our podcast to video, which is a long time. It's been a long time overdue. We're behind.
I didn't even know this though, because Derek, your husband, the producer, he full on is like a podcaster.
Yeah.
He's also a gamer,
No.
but he's a podcaster. And he's like, I watch podcasts all the time on YouTube. I'm like, you actually get on YouTube and watch podcasts?
He watches hours of podcasts. He watches them. So I think, okay, this is Banning's book club and the Book Nook Book Club. This is another divide. There are going to be people who just listen on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and there will be people who watch.
Would I be going too far to say that we might be the next Joe Rogan of Christian podcasts?
You would absolutely be going too far because he is the most listened to podcast in the world.
Okay, maybe we're not there.
So, but that's where we're headed.
We were always putting ourselves up against relevant.
Yeah.
Should we put ourselves up against Joe Rogan now?
Yeah,
I'm kind of new to this world.
Hey, you aim for the stars. You aim for the stars.
I think we make it our goal to get Joe Rogan on this podcast. That's what I think we make it our goal.
That's amazing.
Because I've thought we've wanted to see this podcast go to the next level, and I just feel like what it was missing was my attractiveness. And I think that's
this
coming.
is why Phil's on a bigger screen.
And your jerseys. I'm hoping that you wear a different soccer jersey, football kit every single week.
Yep.
Every week. I do. I love the Mexican national team. So
there we go.
Yes, I will.
So here we are, episode 53, which is actually going to be we're going to be diving into the issue of suffering and the Christian life.
The title, hopefully people click on it because the title will be Suffering and the Christian Life.
Suffering and the Christian life.
Sounds
the theology
exciting.
of suffering in the Christian
The
life.
issue of
We'll
suffering.
figure out
Nothing
where we
like
go.
that suffering clickbait. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So we're excited. But listen, before we dive into all of that, we want to make sure that you subscribe to this channel. You'll notice it's on a new channel, the Jesus Culture Podcast Network. You probably see some new graphics.
We got Authentic You.
Yep.
We've got Man Camp.
Yep.
This podcast, the Jesus Culture Podcast, as well as leadership talks. We
have leadership talks
in there, as well as the
Message of the Week.
Message of the Week.
And then coming soon, little teaser for you, we have a pastor's podcast coming.
That's exactly right.
And it's all going to be on video. So make sure you subscribe and then different
It'll be on audio
playlists.
too for all the people listening right now, the hardcore audio listeners.
I think you're more hardcore if you watch it because that means you like us at another level.
But you can't watch it while you're on the treadmill.
You can. You totally, if you want to walk.
Yeah,
if you want to go slower.
My voice, by the way, I am completely losing my voice, and I have no idea why. So
we've told Banning that the volume he speaks at is.
That's the answer to everything right now.
Banning talks he talks at a level that most humans don't ever need to talk at. So he's just a loud talker. So
I've consistently thought that I should have been born kind of that first great awakening, second great awakening era, that when I'm traveling the country, standing on a tree stump, preaching to 10,000 people in the field.
Yeah.
That's when I should have been born.
So that's why this is a sign from God telling you to be quiet.
From God, something like that, yeah. So it's good. If you guys, Phil, it is good to, if you're not watching the video right now, Phil is joining us via TV.
That's right.
via Zoom and streaming. But we haven't been together in a while. Becky, you've actually been out of commission, which this was a little bit awkward because this was the awkward moment when Phil and I are trying to carry on the podcast without you. And quite frankly, Quite frankly, it went great. It felt like a real home run.
Way to go on that 6-month gap.
It fell off. Yeah, that's true. The few that we did. But you weren't announcing yet that you were pregnant.
Right. because I was
so
so early.
we're closely on like, hey, so Becky's not here again this week, and she's. I don't even know we didn't lie, but we were just like trying to avoid why she's not feeling well, which that was accurate. But so you are here. There's a fourth member of our podcast.
That's right. There's a fourth member of our podcast. I'm pregnant with my third and final baby, and I'm 20 weeks along, and I'm so excited to be done. And I'm only halfway. Only halfway, and I'm ready to be done. But I was out for a long time.
You're in sweater weather. You're in layered sweater weather. So
cozy. So you guys had a long gap, and it just goes to show that the podcast doesn't happen without a woman.
Here's what I want to know, though, real quick, because Phil and I both debated this thing. Did you even listen to the ones that you weren't on? This is horrible. The fact you had to pause right now. This is unbelievable.
Crickets.
The arrogance.
Cue the cricket
arrogance
sound.
In this. That's amazing.
Do you listen to any of them?
Well, I'm on them, so I don't have to.
That's true. Yeah.
I do listen to my sermons when I preach, though.
To grow.
Do you do that, Phil? Do you go back and listen to your sermons?
Not often. Listen, it is so awkward to watch yourself preach. I just I'm alone in my office, just embarrassed.
Banning loves it. He's such a narcissist.
Speaker, and I'm that embarrassed. Imagine watching yourself if you were a bad speaker. That would just be like, people are like, man, when did Phil become such a jerk? I'm joking. Anyways.
Totally.
But it is super embarrassing. One thing, okay, I don't know if when I hear myself, whether it's on video or on audio, to me, my voice sounds distinctively higher than it does in my own head. And so I listen to myself and I'm like, I sound like that? People listen to me every week and I sound like that? It's a little embarrassing.
No, that is a real thing. That's okay. Listen, Johnny Depp, this is some pop culture. He's never watched one of his own movies. He can't stand to watch himself on screen.
Yeah, but he is so eclectic and so kind of artistic.
So Phil's like Johnny
He's
Depp.
Lying.
He's lying.
That's amazing.
Banning makes me listen to myself, and it's difficult. But he says it's good for me to grow. But it
actually is really helpful.
It is.
It's a really helpful tool to grow as a speaker. But
it's cringeworthy. It's a cringeworthy experience.
Phil, anything exciting been happening since we met last? I guess an election happened. We know that.
Yeah. Small things. Just
an election.
Just
surviving
the apocalypse. All I'll say is that in Atlanta, it's 80 degrees right now, and I feel great.
Amazing.
And
is that abnormal?
No, I was in Turkey. I went to Turkey to go visit my sister.
Can you just pause for a second?
World.
Can you share about Turkey? First of all, Phil sends me a picture from Turkey, and it's like on a rooftop.
Mm-hmm.
So he's in a room that walks out onto a rooftop, overlooking. I don't even know what it was. It's a valley. It's not a valley, but all these old homes from whatever. And in the distance is it sandstone? It's like these whenever they put buildings carved into the mountains, and it's this you'll have to describe it, unbelievable. And then there are I don't even know why there are hot air balloons all in the sky.
Can we show a picture? Maybe we could cut to a picture. I bet you we can.
Oh my gosh. But it honestly is here's where I'm at right now. What was going on?
It's crazy. Yeah. So, okay, we were in Cappadocia, and it's like an ancient city built into the bedrock because it's soft rock. And so it dates all the way back to the 6th century BC, and people have been living there, still live there. And you're staying in a cave hotel, and it's one of the most incredible experiences of my life. It's hard to explain. Yeah. And for whatever reason, they have every morning they have hundreds of hot air balloons go up. It's kind of one of the things about the city, but it's amazing. The Christian history in Turkey is unbelievable. We went to ancient Ephesus, we went to Cappadocia, we went to, so if people don't know this, all 7 of the churches from the book of Revelation, they're all in modern day Turkey. So that whole area is just an incredible place.
Is Smyrna?
John the Apostle's grave is in Ephesus. Smyrna, baby. Smyrna
so
is
Phil,
originally from Turkey.
Phil pastors a church in Smyrna, Georgia, which is one of those 7 churches, and that's in Turkey.
Yeah, and we actually went. We were in ancient Smyrna for a little bit.
Did you like your Smyrna or their Smyrna better?
There's not much left of their Smyrna.
Does their Smyrna have a Chick-fil-A?
But it has hot air balloons.
It does not. you always know the glory of God wherever Chick-fil-A is.
That's true.
You actually visited we talked about this. Now, if you know Phil at all, Phil is just a softie, probably cries every sermon. Is that true? I mean, it's not a good sermon if Phil doesn't cry.
No.
And I'm saying that positive. That's not even like a cut on him. I love that about you, Phil. But, and so he had a whole moment at the grave of the Apostle John.
I could not even imagine.
What was that moment?
Oh, it's crazy. I mean, so Emily and I were there, and we're in ancient Ephesus, and St. John's Basilica, which is one of the most kind of ancient churches in the world, is there, built over John's grave. And it's actually a very trusted, like, historical archaeological site. But it's nobody's there. It's really weird. Emily and I were there. We're the only ones there. So we just actually spent time. We prayed, we worshiped. And I'm just sitting at John the Apostle's grave, just like spending time with Jesus, and like suddenly the Spirit of God starts to talk. Like I felt frustrated because this ancient basilica that's actually really important to the Christian faith, it's not cared for. It's basically left in ruins. And I was just kind of feeling like this sense of frustration, like this should be cared for. Why don't they honor it? Like this should be such an honored spot in history. And then it was like the Spirit of the Lord had just reminded me that his legacy doesn't rest in buildings. His legacy is people. And it was just like this deep sense that like the Apostle John's legacy and inheritance was in me. Like I was the Apostle John's inheritance, not whatever building was built, whatever chapel was built over his grave. And it was just like, I mean, I'm serious. It was like a crazy God encounter, being reminded about how our inheritance is people. And the inheritance that I've been called to build as people. And it was really meaningful. Like, honestly, 2020 is hard. I know that's such a generic, stupid statement. But I went to Turkey beat up a little bit. 2020 has been hard, and it's amazing the way God met me. It was a powerful time. It was a powerful time.
Well, while you were over there encountering God at the grave of the Apostle John, I was in my backyard building chicken coops. Very proud of myself the whole time. Never built anything in my life, and I built an actual chicken coop for these chickens that we have on the run. So super similar stories, super similar marking moments in our life that during COVID, you were over in Turkey seeing all this stuff, and I was in my backyard building chicken coops for chickens.
And we wonder why Phil's the only one.
And Becky was throwing up.
And Becky was puking her guts out.
And I was growing a human.
And you were growing a human. We wonder why Phil's the one that has any type of content on this podcast.
Exactly. Phil is the quoted member of the podcast.
Well, we do actually have content that we're going to be talking about. This is actually, Becky, something that's been on your heart. You said
it is.
We're the happy podcast, and you're like, I think we should talk about suffering. I'm reading about suffering. So
this is something that as Banning and Phil are my pastors. They're discipling me. And
did you say Banning and Phil?
Absolutely.
Just Banning, period.
No, they're my mentors.
Just Banning, period. There's no and involved in this conversation.
Phil has radically shaped my life. Anyway, so I'm reading through scripture and I'll text them questions and what do you guys think about this as I'm working things out. And I was reading through the Gospels. I'm reading through my second year reading through the entire Bible in a year, and at this time of the year we're in the Gospels. And I was reading through Matthew, and I read this verse that I had heard it before, but it's different seasons of life. It stuck out to me, and I texted them. I said, guys, I don't ever hear about this topic. Can we talk about this in a podcast? So I'm going to read the verse. It's Matthew 16, verse 24 through 26. It says, Jesus went to work on his disciples. I love that. Jesus went to work on his disciples. Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. This is the Passion Translation. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Follow me and I'll show you how. Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is my way to finding yourself, your true self. What kind of deal is it to get everything you want but lose yourself? What could you ever trade your soul for? And it was, again, I heard that verse a lot, but I'd never... I looked it up in another translation, and those words, don't run from suffering, but embrace it. And I actually thought, I don't know if I've ever heard a message on this, embrace suffering. And I don't know if I'm doing what Jesus said. I think I run from suffering quite a bit. I would like to avoid suffering. And, I started to wrestle with, okay, this is an interesting topic. So I brought it to to my pastors and I said, let's talk about this on the podcast. Let's talk about why don't we hear the message of embrace suffering more? Or I don't know, again, we tease like, yeah, this will be fun. Let's talk about embracing suffering.
Yeah.
Phil, this is going to be now. Phil?
No, I mean, I think there's something very human about having a hard time with suffering or wanting to disassociate from suffering. But I think something we need to recognize in our generation is part of the reason it doesn't get talked about or people avoid it so much is because we have this cultural belief that pain is the enemy and that we have to avoid pain at all costs. We have this kind of cultural belief system that's the goal in life is to be happy. And if the goal in life is to be happy, then pain is an enemy to my life. So I actually, what's happened inside of an entire generation is we try to build our lives in such a way that we avoid pain at all costs. And avoiding pain means avoiding any form of suffering. And I actually think it's a really broken vision of life that pain is not my enemy. And suffering isn't actually a distraction from me being fully alive. Often suffering is the side effect of me living for the things I was actually made to live for. So the heartbreaking thing is not only do we not talk about suffering, but actually people who live their life in a way to avoid suffering, I think are not living into the fullness of who they really are. Everything that is going to transform lives, transform our lives, transform cities, requires that sense of, the way they translate this embracing of suffering. And so I think the heartbreaking thing about it is not only are we so weak here, but what it actually does is it distorts our own lives and futures. When you try to live your life that somehow God's invitation over your life is a way of life that is going to be free of pain, then you have misunderstood so much of the invitation of Jesus. It's not a sadistic. I'm not saying that God likes to cause pain in our lives. What it is that God leads the way in showing us almost everything that is worthy, almost everything that is beautiful, almost everything that changes lives. It actually, you have to go through the doorway of pain, of suffering, of laying down your life to see it made. And so when people avoid suffering, the sad part is they're actually avoiding their future. And I think that's what breaks my heart.
I think we'd have to define pain at some level, I guess. We'd have to define what we're talking about with suffering or things like that. And is that just in the world that you're going to encounter in the world? Does Jesus actually send it? I have a pretty firm stance on, obviously, I think that the Bible talks about suffering. I mean, and obviously we encounter, about persecution, tribulation, trials, hard things that we encounter in our life. I probably run into an issue, I think, when people want to sweep they want to sweep things underneath. When it talks about, John 10:10, the thief came to steal, kill, and destroy. Mm-hmm. Jesus came to give life and life more abundantly. Sometimes I think we do get confused around no, that's actually the fingerprints of the enemy. That's not the fingerprints of Jesus. Sickness being one of those things. Yeah. So I do think we probably don't talk about suffering enough and all that. But then sometimes I'm like, nah, I actually don't think that sickness is from the Lord. I don't think that sickness is in that category of suffering. Right. But because I just can't find that in Scripture.
That, it's true. We have such an incomplete theology. We don't actually know what we believe the Bible has promised us according to not only healing, a victorious life. We also don't understand the works and the schemes of the enemy. Yeah. So it's actually, we have such an incomplete thinking on all of these things, and then so many people's thinking is this really hyper Reformed Calvinistic thinking, which we would actually say is pretty non-biblical, that if God is sovereign, then all of these things are the works of his sovereignty. Yeah. And that's just not true. It's not biblical. It's not historic Christianity. It's not biblical Christianity. It's actually this really broken belief system. And I can't tell, banning, Becky, you too, how many times we've had to walk with people through loss, or we're at these things and they're like, well, God's will be done. I'm like, no, that's not true. That is right. God is not the one who is weaving our lives through. He's testing us through pain and testing us through sickness and testing us through evil. It's not who he is. The Bible actually assures us that's not what he does.
I recently had a conversation with a 16-year-old girl. She's been through some pretty traumatic stuff physically, and she had multiple surgeries, and she's had a rough life. With that, going through stuff at a young age. And we were having this really deep talk. As a youth pastor, I get the great privilege. And I found, Phil, in myself, I need to get with Jesus and the Word and figure out my beliefs here so I can better help pastor young people. And she just kept saying, if God is so good, I've been told my whole life that God is good, why would he have put me through this? And my whole family has told me this is God's way, of just giving you character, and we're sorry you've had to deal with it. And at the, as a 16-year-old working through this, she's like, I don't want anything to do with this God that has thrown suffering at me. And so we just got into this whole talk. I'm like, okay, first of all, I don't believe that. And then again, she's like balanced this growing up of, she goes, and then at church, like, life should be good and Christians should never suffer. And I don't experience that.
Who says that?
But that's exactly.
But I'm a little bit like, who preaches that?
Exactly. That's what I'm telling her. I said, hey, that's not what we're saying. But I think, like you said, Phil, the theology is incomplete, or there's been, in her young experience, there's a lack of, when I started to tell her, Jesus actually talked about suffering. She's like, okay, so he sent it and he meant for me to go through suffering and my life has to be miserable. And it was good. It was challenging. It was deep talking through. I'm like, man, you're right. Like my understanding of this is incomplete. And what is the balance there? Does embrace suffering mean my life has to be miserable? And then the tension of, Jesus said he came to give life abundantly, and there's a promise of hope and joy and peace. So how do you suffer in the midst of...
But we're separating peace. Suffering is not a lack of peace. Suffering is not a lack of hope. We're walking through tough stuff in life. Mm-hmm. What is always there is peace. What is always there is hope. Those things are always there in the midst of it. It's interesting. We live in a fallen, broken, sin-filled world. Mm-hmm. That's tough to walk through sometimes. We experience loss and we experience hard things, and even when you're talking about the young people, you're 16 at some level. I'm not downplaying that, but your story's nowhere close to being
exactly. And this thing she's heard of, God's so good, he doesn't want anything bad to happen to you, and that.
But again,
that belief
I actually
his
don't
sovereignty.
think anybody's saying that.
Right.
But here's my deal. I actually don't think anybody's saying that. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody say God doesn't want anything to ever happen to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. No, it's good. Yeah, these sweeping statements that.
Yeah, we do,
make.
And I think we just have normalized a Christianity where biblical literacy is so low that we don't know how to actually talk through these things. And to me, one of the things, there's a lot of things for us to understand about having a understanding of the vision of suffering that comes in the scriptures. But it's also, I think, when we're talking about with people, we have to get underneath. People say things, but what the reality is there's things underneath what they're actually saying. And I even in what you shared, Becky, and my heart just would go out to this person who's walked through tremendous things, as all of us would. But often what we don't understand is we have this assumption that if pain exists or suffering exists, that somehow God isn't good. It becomes like an accusation against his character. But what we don't understand, when you think about this is that, we're all parents here, and one of the things you do when you teach your kids is that they can't, you're not to touch the stove, right? This is why you teach your kids all these little things that they should or shouldn't do. And part of the reason why is because you can't actually always tell if a stove is on or it's hot or not. But if my son, I've got kids, my youngest Cyrus, who's 4 years old, the stove is on and it doesn't look hot, and he puts his hand on there and he begins to burn himself. What's interesting is pain is not actually the problem in that moment. We forget that pain's
actually a good thing in that moment.
Right.
Pain's letting you know danger.
Absolutely. The problem, right, is that his hand is burning off, and pain is actually the alarm bell that's saying something is wrong. Something is wrong. You have to see this. And I think we forget that this is actually, pain is a friend, because pain is trying to communicate something. And what we have to come to peace with is that God has allowed pain to stay in the story of the world. Why? Because pain isn't really the problem. The problem is that we've been disconnected from the Father. And I actually think if God took away pain like that, it would be the most unloving thing that he could do, because it's not the real problem. The problem is that we were made for intimacy with God. We were made for union with the Father. And it's actually the fact that the world is broken, that these things exist in the world is meant to be the alarm bell that's saying, hey, something is wrong. Pay attention. Something's wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think so often we forget that actually God is trying to get to the root, which is union with him. And he's going after that for the entire world. And we have come up with a very faulted way of thinking that pain is somehow the problem or the accusation against God's character.
I think it's not. I think as well. I think that there's, I don't know anybody who is saying you're not going to ever, like the Christian life is you never walk through hard things. You're going to walk through hard things.
Yeah.
The reality is though, even walking through those hard things, you can be victorious. Mm. You can walk in peace. You can be more than a conqueror. You can like all of these things. Mm-hmm. And I don't. Maybe there's people out there that are teaching you should never have to walk through hard things ever. You should never experience loss. You should never go through tough situations. You should never have relationships that are not trying. Mm-hmm. And I do think we would have to define suffering at some level. Are we? Is it just? There's hard things that we walk through.
Right.
There's tough relationships. There's loss that we deal with.
Yeah.
Things don't work out like we thought. They take longer than we thought.
Yeah.
And just trying to, the promises are still good in that moment.
It's true. And I think that this conversation, and actually a lot of young people, it's funny, and I probably limited experience and they're young, but I'm preaching to youth and I'm talking about the promise of following Jesus. Like this is what is best for you. And it's like that argument, what if God is so good? Why is all this bad stuff happen? If he could take it all away. And I think I'm realizing like, I need to do a better job at
That's a different
Right.
conversation.
Right.
If God is so good, why does bad stuff happen? Mm-hmm. That's a different even podcast topic.
It's true.
Because we live in a broken world, because
Right.
people have free will, because there's sin involved, because there are choices that impact people, because God just doesn't come down and control everybody. I mean, there's these type of
Right.
things.
But when you bring in the words of Jesus, I'm like, actually, there's nowhere where Jesus says you won't suffer. And in this verse, he's saying, embrace it. Don't run from it. And that just kind of...
But it's very similar language, though, and I would probably have more of a theology of weakness, even more than suffering. They're probably similar to me, but it's the same thing when Paul's like, man, I delight in weakness because in this moment, God's strong.
Right.
So those suffering moments, those times where I feel weak, those times when I don't feel like I have enough, those times when I don't think I'm going to be able to make it, like those times... Mm-hmm. That's when God manifests his strength in my life. That's when I learn another level of depth to the character of God, and that he'll never leave me nor forsake me. And so I think that for me, I don't know if I probably haven't taught much on suffering. I've taught much on weakness.
Yeah, absolutely.
On not run, and it's the same language. Like I delight in weakness.
Yeah.
I take joy in weakness. Like these are the things, trials, tribulations. These are things that I embrace. So I think that maybe those two things are connected.
Yeah. And I think even Becky, to the the passage you're even talking about where Jesus is inviting us to pick up our cross and follow him. It's more about a holistic vision of saying the invitation of Jesus really is to die to my agenda and to live for his, to die to building my name and to live for building his name, to die to my way and to his way. So this invitation of it's saying, hey, this vision of picking up your own cross and embracing it, it's really about calling us, saying, listen, if you want to live, you have to die to self. If you want to know why you're really alive, you have to stop trying to build project self. It's really about making that switch. And you do, to really follow Jesus, you can't try to actually do it yourself, to make yourself your own God, to make yourself your own way of living. Like that, you have to actually come and exchange my life for your life, my past for your future, my sin for your righteousness. It really is this exchange. And so when I think that vision of embrace it, it's saying to follow Jesus is to die to self and to live for him, right? And it's what 2 Corinthians 5 says, that those who now live should no longer live for themselves, but for him whom on their behalf died and rose again. And I think that's the vision. It's not this kind of like vague, hey, there's suffering, let's go embrace it. Yeah. It's really about the invitation of saying to follow Jesus is really dying to self. And that in American Christianity is an unwanted posture. And that's what we have to reclaim, that following Jesus really is about dying to ourselves and lifting up his name.
Oh, that's true.
And I think this is the reality. I think that obviously in one podcast, we're not going to solve or completely unpack this issue except for this. I think it's something that everybody needs to dive into at some level and get a holistic view of what Jesus teaches. And how much of it is Western culture compared to biblical culture. And I think for me, I think there's probably some reaction as well to whether it's people putting sickness and suffering, or I grew up in an environment where unhappiness was like holy. I mean, I grew up,
like
I grew up with the leaders in our environment were poor, drove really old, junky cars. But there was this idea of like, well, yeah, when you're poor, when you don't have enough, when you barely make it, that's really
Christ-like,
when you're holy. That's really when you're Christ-like.
Yeah.
And yet that's not real either.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you're defining how you're doing by your bank account at all.
Right.
But you can't define how you're doing by your bank account when it's big, and you can't define how you're doing by your bank account when it's small. Like those things, I don't think are the. But that was it.
Oh
like,
yeah, Banning, it's so good.
We want to
right?
stay
It's
in that spot.
Yeah.
It's like through this overreaction to really bad teaching and like a prosperity gospel mindset, people run to a poverty gospel mindset, and they're both flawed.
They're both wrong.
That's really good. That should be another podcast too, the prosperity versus poverty mindsets, because I've had come across people who are like, oh, that's how Jesus lived, so we are to live that way as well. Like, or there's no biblical reference for being wealthy. That's not good.
Which isn't true either.
Right.
Do you know that, first of all, Jesus, they talk through this type of stuff. Like Jesus, his garment was a pretty expensive garment. They talk through that. Have you dove into that, hearing those teachings? But even the scripture where he became poor so that we might be rich, it's actually a that Greek word is a financial word. I'm just saying there's a lot of stuff. Abraham, you can go down the thing of
King Solomon.
But again, it's the issue again. It's not money, it's the love of money, which is the death to self type concept. It's unwilling to surrender all for him. This was the issue of the young rich ruler who comes to Jesus. It wasn't the issue of money for him. It was the issue of that's the one thing he was unwilling to surrender.
Right.
It was the one thing he was unwilling to fully surrender to Jesus.
Yeah.
So I don't think that you don't look at that passage and go, well, I think that Jesus across the board looks at everybody and says to follow me, you have to sell everything.
Right.
I physically.
Right.
You do have to spiritually sell everything. You do have to be willing to walk away from all of it if he asked you to do.
Yeah, hold it loosely.
I remember because I was talking to somebody who's got a millionaire many times over, and I was saying, hey, I really, is it even possible to raise up people, young people especially, see some of these guys in entertainment, see some of these young athletes, is it even possible to raise up strong believers in these environments when fame and money is involved? And he said a really interesting statement. He said, yes, but they have to be willing to walk away from it if Jesus asks them. And that's a heart issue. I can't determine that.
Yeah.
But if Jesus came and said, today, $50 million, I want you to walk away from it.
Yeah.
You have to be able to walk away from it unless that $50 million is a problem.
Yeah.
The $50 million is a problem if you're not willing to walk away from it when Jesus asked you to walk away from it. And that's what the rich young ruler was unwilling to do.
Yeah, it's so true.
And I think even in that's it, Banning. Like it's that Jesus is worth suffering for, whatever that might be. And so if suffering presents itself in our life, that if being faithful to Jesus means walking through it, then yes, embrace it with all you have, because Jesus is worthy whatever the cost is. And not that it's always going to be found in suffering, but if suffering gets into that place, whatever it may be, cultural persecution, or we're walking through hard seasons, that somehow following Jesus faithfully has to invite this in a moment, that the posture of the Christian heart is he's worth it. And rather than actually accusing God, or I'm going to make some kind of statements or running away, it's that Jesus is worth it, whatever it means. Whatever it means to be faithful to him, he's worth it.
Well, listen, Here we go. The second video podcast.
Yep.
Episode 53.
We could go. I had 6 more questions, but we'll end it there. Yep.
Me losing my voice, Phil on a TV screen,
Yes.
the new YouTube channel. But it's
You know what
always
we're gonna
good
have to deal with now? I just thought comments. We're gonna get haters in the comments.
Can't we turn off comments?
We're turning off comments.
Boy, every time you turn off comments,
I was
they
going to
hate you
ask
for turning
you
off.
guys where your masks are. I'm alone, but
This is 6 feet.
Yeah, totally.
So comment if you're nice.
Yeah, totally.
We'd love to hear
Can
your
we
thoughts.
delete? We can't delete comments on YouTube, can we?
I don't know.
I don't know how that
this
works
This is a whole
either.
new world. But make sure you subscribe to the Jesus Culture Podcast Network channel. And then we have Man Camps coming to video. Authentic You, our women's podcast, coming to video.
The Pastors Podcast.
In 2021. We're going to come up with a teaser. 4 pastors.
4 pastors.
1
by
microphone.
Pastors. 1 massive rant venting session.
That's coming next year. Thanks for watching. We're really excited to be back. We are back now. We've got topics and content coming at you.
Phil, go enjoy your 80-degree weather.
Yep.
I
And
will.
we'll see your New Jersey next week.
Yep.
Sounds good. I'm all in.
See you guys.